A single word was supposed to keep her safe. 8-year-old Rima had been taught since she could talk. Never go with anyone unless they know the password. Her parents thought they'd done everything right. They'd given their daughter a secret code word, unicorn, a word so special, so private, that only the people who truly loved her would know it. On a spring afternoon in 1985, a pickup truck pulled alongside the little blonde girl as she walked home from school, proudly carrying an art project to show her mother. When the driver leaned out the window and said that magic word, unicorn, Rima smiled with recognition and climbed right in. The password worked perfectly, but not the way her parents intended, because the man behind the wheel was someone the family trusted completely, someone who'd been in their home that very morning, someone they called friend. This is the story of how Joseph Kondro used the deepest bonds of trust to destroy two families, how he hid in plain sight for 14 years, and how advancing forensic science finally brought a predator to justice. But it's also a story about the devastating truth that the monsters we fear aren't always strangers. Lurking in shadows, sometimes they're the people we invite to dinner. This is the story of the unicorn betrayal. Before we begin, I want to provide an important content warning. This case involves crimes against children. While I'll discuss the investigation, the forensic evidence, and the path to justice, I will not be providing graphic details of violence. My focus is on honoring the victims, understanding how these crimes were solved, and exploring what we can learn to protect children today. If you need to step away at any point, please do so. Longview, Washington, in the mid-1980s was the kind of place where neighbors knew each other's names. Located in Cowlitz County in southwestern Washington, about 50 miles north of Portland, Oregon, and 120 miles south of Seattle, Longview was a timber and paper mill town where families put down roots and children played freely in tree-lined neighborhoods. The Highlands area where the Traxler family lived embodied that small-town trust. Parents felt comfortable letting their children walk to and from school. Kids rode bikes until the streetlights came on. It was a community built on the assumption that people looked out for each other's children. On the afternoon of May 15, 1985, that sense of safety would be shattered forever. Rima Traxler was 8 years old and in 3rd grade at Street Helens Elementary School, located at 431 27th Avenue. She was one of those children teachers remember fondly, well-behaved, academically successful, genuinely enthusiastic about learning. She loved going to school, loved her teachers, and took pride in her work. On that May afternoon, Rima was particularly excited. She'd completed an art project in class, something she'd worked hard on, something she couldn't wait to show her mother. As school let out that spring day, Rima clutched her artwork and began the familiar walk home. She stood 4 feet 3 inches tall and weighed just 45 pounds. Her blonde hair, mid-back length and shining in the afternoon sun, was pulled back with a rainbow-colored barrette. She wore a tan plaid skirt, a pink shirt, a knee-length tan coat with a wraparound belt, white tights, and dark brown clogs. Her ears were pierced, a recent treat she'd been proud of. The route from Street Helens Elementary to her home was straightforward, approximately 10 blocks through the safe, familiar streets of the Highlands neighborhood. Rima had walked it many times before. She knew the way. She knew the rules. A neighbor spotted Rima at approximately 3:30 that afternoon. The woman remembered the encounter clearly because Rima had stopped to show off her school art project with the innocent pride of a child who'd worked hard on something creative. The location was 27th Avenue and Beach Street, just 2 blocks from home, just 2 blocks from safety. Rima waved goodbye to the neighbor and continued walking, her art project carefully held so it wouldn't wrinkle. She was minutes away from showing her mother what she'd made, minutes away from the after-school snack waiting at home, minutes away from telling her mom about her day. She never arrived. Danelle Kin's life wasn't easy. A single mother living on welfare and food stamps, she was raising Rima and her 5-year-old son in a small home in the Highlands. She'd recently separated from Rima's stepfather, Rusty Traxler. Though Rusty remained involved in the children's lives, and they maintained a cordial relationship focused on co-parenting. Danelle knew Rima's routine down to the minute. When 3:45 became 4 o'clock, then 4:15, the first threads of worry began to weave through her mind. When 4:30 arrived with no sign of her daughter, worry transformed into fear. By 5 o'clock, Danelle was in full panic. She ran through the neighborhood, knocking on doors, calling Rima's name, asking everyone she encountered if they'd seen a little blonde girl in a tan coat carrying an art project. Every neighbor joined the search. Every friend was contacted. Every possible explanation was explored and discarded. Rima wouldn't have wandered off. She wasn't that kind of child. She followed rules. She was responsible. And she'd been so excited to show her mother that art project. In her panic and desperation, Danelle did what seemed natural at the time. She went to a friend's house, someone she trusted, someone who'd been part of their lives for years. Joseph Kondro was an old high school classmate of Rusty's, someone they'd known since their teenage years. He lived nearby. He was always willing to help. That very morning, Kondro and Rusty had been sitting together on their porch drinking beer while Danelle mowed the lawn. The friendship between the two men went back to their days at R.A. Long High School. Kondro had been woven into the fabric of their lives for years. When Danelle knocked on Kondro's door that terrible evening, he appeared concerned and sympathetic. He invited her inside. He let her use his telephone to call the Longview Police Department to file a missing person report. As Danelle stood in his home, her voice shaking as she described her missing daughter to the police dispatcher, Joseph Kondro stood nearby, offering comfort and support. He knew exactly where Rima was, because he'd put her there himself, just hours earlier. Danelle and Rusty had been careful parents. They'd read the news stories about child abductions. They'd watched the reports on television about stranger danger. They'd taken what they believed were important precautions to keep their children safe. The password was Rusty's idea, implemented when Rima was very young. They chose the word unicorn, something magical and memorable for a little girl, but not a word that would come up in casual conversation. They drilled it into Rima's mind from the time she could understand. Never, ever go with anyone unless they can tell you the password. If someone says they're here to pick you up, Rusty had explained to his stepdaughter repeatedly, they have to know the magic word. If they don't know unicorn, you don't go with them. You run away and find a grown-up you trust. Rima had the lesson memorized. She'd been taught it so many times, it was second nature. The password would keep her safe. But there was a flaw in the plan, a vulnerability that Rusty and Danelle never anticipated. The password was meant to protect Rima from strangers. What they didn't consider was what would happen if someone they trusted, someone they'd invited into their lives and their home, learned that password through the normal course of friendship. Rusty had shared the password with Joseph Kondro. Why wouldn't he? Kondro was a trusted friend, someone who'd known Rima since she was small. If there was ever an emergency, if Rusty ever needed Kondro to pick up Rima from school, he'd need to know the password. It made perfect sense at the time. On May 15, 1985, that act of trust would have devastating consequences. Later, when Joseph Kondro finally confessed to his crimes 14 years after Rima's disappearance, he described that afternoon with disturbing clarity and absolutely no remorse. He'd been driving through the neighborhood, heading to a local convenience store to buy beer and cigarettes, when he spotted the little blonde girl walking along Beach Street. He recognized her immediately, Rusty's stepdaughter, the bright-eyed child he'd watched grow up. And in that moment, something crystallized in his mind. Later, Kondro would describe his thought process in chilling terms. If she gets into my car, I'm going to take her out to the woods. It wasn't an impulse. It wasn't an accident. It was a conscious decision, made in the space of seconds, to destroy a child's life. Kondro pulled his pickup truck alongside Rima and rolled down the window. When the 8-year-old saw him, a familiar face, a friend of her stepfather's, someone who'd been at her house that very morning, she approached without hesitation. "Hi, Joe," Rima said, her voice bright with recognition. "Hi," Kondro replied. "I'm here to pick you up." Then he spoke the magic word. Unicorn. Unicorn. Rima's face lit up. The password meant this was official. It meant her parents had sent someone they trusted. It meant everything was okay. "She just jumped in my truck," Kondro would later recall with detached matter-of-factness. Bang! Closes the door. As he pulled away from the curb with Rima securely buckled into the passenger seat, Kondro spun a story. He was taking her to a swimming hole, he explained. A beautiful spot where they could swim and have fun. Her parents would meet them there later. It would be an adventure. Rima believed every word. She trusted him completely. The swimming hole Kondro described was real, a remote location along Germany Creek, approximately 12 miles west of Longview along Ocean Beach Highway toward the Stella area. It was isolated, beautiful, and far from witnesses. It was also the place where Rima Traxler would lose her life. The Longview Police Department responded to Danelle's missing person report with appropriate urgency. An 8-year-old child who was reliable, well-behaved, and excited to get home to show her mother a school project doesn't simply vanish. This wasn't a runaway situation. This was an abduction. Within hours, the entire community mobilized. Search parties formed spontaneously, with neighbors, friends, and complete strangers combing through yards, parks, wooded areas, and every conceivable hiding place. Flyers were printed and distributed throughout Longview and surrounding communities. Local news media picked up the story, broadcasting Rima's description and photograph across the region. By May 23rd, just 8 days after Rima's disappearance, community members had established the Help Find Rima Fund at Cowlitz Bank, located at 927 Commerce Avenue. The fund helped cover the mounting costs of the search, long-distance phone calls to follow up leads, gas for search parties, postage for mailing flyers, and copying costs for distributing Rima's photograph as widely as possible. The response was overwhelming. In a time before social media, before Amber Alerts, before the instant communication we take for granted today, the people of Longview and Cowlitz County demonstrated what community means. They refused to give up. They refused to let Rima become just another statistic. In the mid-1980s, a new tool for finding missing children was emerging. Photographs printed on milk cartons. The concept was simple but revolutionary. Put missing children's faces in homes across America, in a place people looked every single morning at the breakfast table. Rima Traxler became one of the first missing children featured on milk cartons in the Pacific Northwest. Every morning, as families poured milk into their cereal or coffee, they saw her face, her blonde hair, her blue eyes, her sweet smile, the description of what she'd been wearing when she vanished. The milk carton campaign kept Rima's case alive in the public consciousness. It ensured that even as days became weeks, and weeks became months, people didn't forget. Somewhere out there, someone might see something, remember something, know something that could bring her home. But as spring turned to summer, and summer faded to fall, hope began to diminish. No credible sightings emerged. No ransom demands arrived. No evidence surfaced. Rima had simply vanished, as if the earth had swallowed her whole. Detectives working the case did what investigators always do. In missing child cases, they looked hard at the family first. Statistically, when a child disappears, someone close to the family is usually involved. It's an uncomfortable truth, but one that guides early investigation. Rusty Traxler, Rima's stepfather, quickly became a focus of intense scrutiny. The fact that he and Danelle had recently separated raised questions. Could this be revenge? Could the breakup have triggered something dark? Police asked Rusty to submit to polygraph examinations. He agreed, wanting to cooperate fully. But the results were devastating. Rusty failed not one, but 2 separate polygraph tests. Some sources indicate he may have failed as many as 3. Polygraphs aren't admissible in court, they're not reliable enough, too prone to false positives triggered by nervousness or stress. But they guide investigations, and 2 failed polygraphs made Rusty look guilty. His alibi seemed weak. Rusty claimed he'd been driving around with a local woman for much of the afternoon when Rima disappeared, cruising around until his truck ran low on gas, at which point he returned home to find police vehicles in his driveway and officers waiting to question him about his missing stepdaughter. Investigators didn't believe his story. The timeline seemed off. The woman's corroboration seemed unreliable. And those failed polygraphs hung over everything, like a dark cloud. As the investigation intensified, detectives developed a theory. Rusty Traxler, angry about the breakup with Danelle, had taken or harmed Rima in an act of twisted revenge, and he hadn't acted alone. By 1988, 3 years after Rima's disappearance, investigators publicly announced they believed the little girl was deceased. They also revealed they had identified 2 persons of interest in the case. The police theory centered on a psychological dynamic. One person with a strong, dominant personality, and one person with a weaker, more submissive personality. Detectives believed the dominant personality was threatening the weaker one into silence, preventing a confession that might bring closure. They theorized that the weaker personality would feel guilt and remorse that somewhere inside this person, the weight of what had happened to Rima ate away at them. But the dominant personality, according to their theory, would feel nothing. By 1992, 7 years after the disappearance, a detective made a telling statement to the media. "We have sufficient evidence in her disappearance, but not enough to make an arrest." That same year, Rima Traxler revealed the identity of the second person of interest, his male friend who lived in Kelso and who had been with him during a portion of the day Rima vanished. That friend was Joseph Kondro. The investigation into Rima's disappearance destroyed the bond between Rima Traxler and Joseph Kondro completely. The two men, who'd been friends since high school, who'd shared beers on countless afternoons, who'd trusted each other with their deepest secrets, became enemies. Rusty believed Kondro had information he wasn't sharing. Kondro resented the constant police attention, the suspicion, the accusatory questions. Each man felt betrayed by the other. But despite the suspicion, despite the police focus, despite 7 years of investigation, no arrests were made. Prosecutors didn't have enough evidence to charge anyone. No body had been found. No physical evidence linked either man to Rima's disappearance. The case was built on suspicion and failed polygraphs, not enough for a conviction. The case went cold. Donnell Ken, unable to bear staying in Longview any longer, eventually moved to Cripple Creek, Colorado. She tried to rebuild her life, tried to find some measure of peace, but the not knowing haunted her every day. Was Rima alive somewhere? Had someone taken her far away? Or had the worst happened? Without answers, without closure, Donnell existed in a terrible limbo, unable to mourn properly because there was always that tiny sliver of hope, but unable to move forward because the uncertainty was paralyzing. For 14 years, the truth remained buried. And Joseph Kondro, the man who held all the answers, went on with his life. To understand how Joseph Kondro could commit such horrific acts, we need to understand where he came from and what shaped him. Because the warning signs were there from the very beginning, visible to anyone who looked closely enough. Joseph Robert Kondro was born on May 19, 1959, in Marquette, Michigan. His biological mother, a Chippewa woman, already had 6 other children when Joseph was born. For reasons that were never fully documented, she made the difficult decision to place her infant son for adoption. John and Eleanor Kondro adopted the baby and raised him initially in Iron River, Michigan, before the family relocated to Castle Rock, Washington, in the Pacific Northwest. On the surface, it might have seemed like a stable, normal childhood. But behind closed doors, something was terribly wrong with young Joseph Kondro. By all accounts, Joseph was a deeply disturbed child from his earliest years. While attending Catholic parochial school, he was constantly in fights with other children. But these weren't ordinary schoolyard scuffles. They were vicious, disproportionate attacks that frightened other students and concerned teachers. The violence extended beyond human targets. Joseph killed animals, including neighborhood pets, with a casualness that alarmed everyone who witnessed it. The torture and killing of animals is one of the most well-established warning signs of developing psychopathy, particularly when it begins in early childhood. Even more disturbing, Joseph began drinking alcohol at the age of 7. Where a 7-year-old obtained alcohol, and why no intervention occurred, remains unclear from available records. But the early substance abuse compounded his already severe behavioral problems. Most horrifying of all, even as a child himself, Joseph Kondro was molesting young girls. This wasn't normal childhood curiosity or age-appropriate exploration. This was predatory behavior, targeting vulnerable children for sexual gratification. By the time he reached adolescence, murder fantasies had developed and intensified in his mind. Later in life, Kondro would describe with disturbing clarity how he spent his teenage years fantasizing about killing, about the power it would give him, about how it would feel. Every single warning sign of a developing serial predator was present, and nothing was done to stop it. As Joseph Kondro grew into adulthood, he developed something that would serve him well in his predatory activities: charm. Despite the monster lurking beneath, Kondro could be smooth-talking, likable, even charismatic when he wanted to be. People who knew him casually often described him as like a big teddy bear, someone who seemed friendly and helpful, if perhaps a bit rough around the edges. He stood 5 feet 10 inches tall and eventually weighed around 260 pounds with a solid, imposing build that nonetheless didn't immediately frighten people. His uncle, Bernard Kondro, who was 83 years old in 1999, would later provide a more accurate assessment. He's just no good. He's a real smooth con man. Very, very smooth. Very deceptive. He can fool you awful easy by his smooth talk. That ability to charm and deceive, that capacity to present a false front while hiding the predator within, is characteristic of psychopathic personalities. Kondro could make people trust him, make them want to help him, make them believe he was their friend. It was all a lie. Kondro's adult criminal record before the murders already painted a picture of someone with no respect for law or other people. His offenses included auto theft, petty theft, multiple drunk driving arrests, domestic violence against partners, drug dealing, forgery, chronic substance abuse that spiraled out of control repeatedly. He moved from job to job, never holding steady employment for long. He worked as a mill worker in Longview for a time, but was eventually let go. Money was always tight, not because of bad luck, but because Kondro spent what he had on drugs and alcohol. He fathered between 6 and 8 children with different women, but never provided financial support for any of them. He moved in and out of relationships, charming women initially, but revealing his true nature once they were committed. Julie West was married to Kondro from 1986 to 1989, a 3-year period during which she saw behind the mask. She would later describe him as initially charming, but ultimately consumed by his addictions. His drugs got the best of him. The drugs were both a cause and an effect. Kondro used substances to quiet the violent urges in his mind, but the substances also lowered his inhibitions and made it easier for him to act on his darkest impulses. Throughout the 1980s and early 1990s, Kondro deliberately positioned himself within families that had young daughters. This wasn't coincidence, it was strategy. He cultivated friendships with men who had children. He made himself useful to single mothers who needed help. He offered to babysit, to give rides, to help with household projects. He attended family gatherings and holiday celebrations. He became Uncle Joe to children whose parents trusted him. All of it was grooming not just of the children, but of the entire family structure around them. Later, Kondro would explain his methodology with chilling precision. Try to do this with a stranger or something like that. You know, they always fight back. I wanted everything to run perfectly. And it did. He understood that children who knew him, who trusted him, who saw him as a safe adult in their lives, wouldn't fight back. They wouldn't scream. They wouldn't run. They would do exactly what he told them to do, because that's what good children do when trusted adults give them instructions. It was calculated, it was deliberate, and it worked. While Joseph Kondro was living his life in Longview and Kelso, hiding in plain sight, he wasn't dormant. He was actively offending, actively harming children, actively feeding the compulsion he would later describe as an addiction. In 1991, Kondro committed sexual assaults against multiple young girls in Clark County, Washington. The victims were between 7 and 10 years old. The specific details of how he gained access to these children, how he isolated them, and what he did to them are appropriately sealed in court records to protect the victims' privacy. What we know is that in May 1997, while Kondro was already in custody facing murder charges for the death of Kara Rudd, he was tried separately in Clark County for these offenses. The trial was swift. The evidence was overwhelming. In less than 2.5 hours of deliberation, the jury returned guilty verdicts on charges of first-degree child rape and first-degree child molestation. The judge sentenced Kondro to between 12 and 16 years in prison, ultimately 14 years when the sentence was finalized. This conviction demonstrated beyond any doubt that Kondro had an established pattern of targeting, grooming, and assaulting young girls. It wasn't an isolated incident. It wasn't a one-time loss of control. It was who he was. And while he sat in jail awaiting trial for Kara Rudd's murder, while prosecutors built their case, while his defense attorneys scrambled to save his life, the Clark County conviction served as a preview of the monster that would be fully revealed. 11 years after Rima Traxler vanished from a Longview street, Another family in the same community would learn the devastating cost of trusting Joseph Kondro. Kara Patricia Rudd was born on March 26, 1984, and by 1996 she was a bright, popular 12-year-old student at Monticello Middle School in Longview. She had blonde hair like Rima, a ready smile, and a close relationship with her mother and siblings. Kara lived with her mother, Janet Lepre, who would later remarry and become Janet Holden, and her two siblings in the Highlands area, the same neighborhood where Rima had lived. It was still considered a safe, family-friendly community, though Rima's unsolved disappearance over a decade earlier remained a whispered source of unease. Janet had known Joseph Kondro since they were kids themselves. They'd grown up in the same area, attended the same schools, moved in the same social circles. When Kondro needed a place to stay, when he was struggling with money and housing, Janet made what seemed like a charitable decision. She allowed him to live in the garage of her family's home. For approximately 8 months, Joseph Kondro lived in that garage, integrated into the daily life of the Rudd family. He was there in the mornings, when the kids woke up. He was there in the evenings when they did homework. He was at family dinners. He was part of their world. Kara and her sister called him Uncle Joe. By October 1996, 1 month before Kara's disappearance, the situation had deteriorated beyond repair. Kondro's chronic drinking problems, the alcoholism that had plagued him since childhood, had escalated to dangerous levels. When drunk, Kondro's violent temper emerged. He would become aggressive, threatening, unpredictable. He experienced blackouts where he couldn't remember what he'd said or done. And during these episodes, he had threatened Kara and her siblings. Janet made the difficult decision to evict him from the garage. It wasn't easy, they had history together, and she felt guilty putting him out. But her children's safety had to come first. The drinking, the temper, the threats, it had all become too much. Kondro left the property, but he didn't go quietly. He resented the eviction. He felt betrayed by someone he considered a friend. And in his twisted mind, he placed the blame squarely on the children, particularly on Kara. Later, Kondro would claim that he blamed Kara for taking away his free meal ticket by complaining about him to her mother. In his narcissistic worldview, a 12-year-old child was responsible for his homelessness, his drinking, his problems. It was insane reasoning. It was the justification of a psychopath. And it put Kara Rudd in terrible danger. The morning of Thursday, November 21st, 1996, began like any other school day for the Rudd family. Janet's longtime boyfriend dropped Kara off at Monticello Middle School, watching until she walked toward the building before driving away to work. But Kara had other plans that day. She'd told a close friend that she intended to skip school. Whether she had a specific reason or simply wanted a day off, something many 12-year-olds have contemplated, isn't entirely clear from available records. What matters is that she didn't go to her classes. Instead, at some point that morning in the school parking lot, a female classmate witnessed something that would become the most critical piece of evidence in the case that would follow. The classmate saw Kara walking across the parking lot toward a distinctive gold 1982 Pontiac Firebird. The driver was visible, Joseph Kondro, the man who used to live in Kara's garage, the man the kids called Uncle Joe. The witness watched as Kara reached the Firebird and got inside. Kondro's car pulled out of the school parking lot with the 12-year-old in the passenger seat. It was the last time anyone except her killer would see Kara Rudd alive. When Monticello Middle School called Janet that afternoon to report that Kara had been marked absent from all her classes, immediate alarm bells went off. Kara wasn't the kind of kid who skipped school regularly. This was unusual, concerning. When Kara didn't return home by her normal time, when phone calls to friends revealed that no one had seen her since morning, Janet's concern transformed into panic. At 5 o'clock that evening, Janet Lepre reported her 12-year-old daughter missing to the Longview Police Department. But unlike with Rima Traxler 11 years earlier, this investigation had an immediate prime suspect. The witness who'd seen Kara getting into Kondro's Firebird that morning came forward immediately. Within hours, police knew exactly who they needed to talk to. Joseph Kondro was brought in for questioning within days of Kara's disappearance. Detectives noticed something immediately: unexplained scratches and lacerations on his skin, some appearing fresh, as if from a struggle. More tellingly, some of the scratches appeared to have flakes of nail polish embedded in them, consistent with defensive wounds from someone with long fingernails fighting back. Kara Rudd had long fingernails. She liked to paint them. When confronted, Kondro had no adequate explanation for the injuries. He became evasive, contradictory in his statements. But he'd had time to prepare. He'd showered thoroughly, scrubbing his skin. He'd washed his clothes. He'd thrown away his shoes, the shoes he'd been wearing that day, gone into a dumpster somewhere. Kondro knew what evidence could do. He'd watched the advances in forensic science. He'd seen how DNA was revolutionizing criminal investigations. And he'd done everything he could to eliminate evidence connecting him to whatever had happened to Kara. What he didn't count on was another aspect of his behavior being noticed. Within days of Kara's disappearance, police arrested Joseph Kondro, not for murder, not yet, but for witness tampering. Investigators had evidence that Kondro had allegedly approached his ex-wife and asked her to withhold information about Kara's disappearance. He tried to manipulate someone close to him to protect himself, to create alibis, to muddy the investigative waters. It was enough to arrest him, to hold him while they built their case. But arrest wasn't the same as finding Kara. And as November became December, as weeks passed without any sign of the missing 12-year-old, hope faded. 6 weeks of desperate searching. Cowlitz County Detective Sergeant Jim Dusha and Detective Sergeant Steve Rehome led the intensive investigation into Kara's disappearance. They organized massive search parties that combed through Longview and surrounding areas. Volunteers turned out by the hundreds, searching wooded areas, abandoned buildings, ravines, parks, anywhere a body might be hidden. The searches were methodical, professional, and increasingly desperate. Every day that passed without finding Kara decreased the likelihood she was still alive. Everyone involved in the investigation understood the terrible truth. They were probably looking for a body now, not a living child. Christmas came and went. Janet Holden spent the holidays in anguish, unable to celebrate, unable to do anything but wait for news. Kara's siblings struggled to understand why their sister hadn't come home. The community grieved, but without a body, without confirmation, there was this terrible uncertainty. Maybe, somehow, Kara had run away. Maybe she was alive somewhere. But deep down, everyone feared the worst. Detective Scott McDaniel of the Longview Police Department had been working the case alongside the Cowlitz County detectives. He'd interviewed witnesses, followed leads, coordinated search efforts, and he developed a deep familiarity with Joseph Kondro, his habits, his haunts, the places he frequented. One location kept coming up, the Mount Solo area near the Columbia River. Kondro spent time there. He knew the terrain. It was remote, wooded, the kind of place someone might hide evidence. After 44 days of searching, with Christmas behind them and a new year dawning, McDaniel made a decision. On January 4, 1997, he ordered a search team to focus on the Mount Solo area, specifically the wooded ravines about 1 mile off Industrial Way. It was a hunch, an educated guess based on accumulated knowledge and investigative instinct. But it was enough. The search team moved carefully through the Mount Solo ravines, a challenging landscape of steep slopes, dense vegetation, and scattered debris from years of illegal dumping. About 50 yards from a dirt road that served the Solo View Estates area, they found an abandoned red Volkswagen car shell, rust-eaten and overgrown with vegetation. Inside the rusted hulk, they discovered a black Reebok t-shirt. One of the searchers got down on hands and knees and looked underneath the Volkswagen. What he saw would haunt him forever. Wedged beneath the abandoned car body, partially nude and obviously deceased, was Kara Rudd. After 44 days, the search was over. But the nightmare for Kara's family was just beginning a new, terrible chapter. The discovery of Kara's body, while heartbreaking, provided investigators with something crucial: evidence. Kara had been missing for 6 weeks. Her body had been exposed to the elements, rain, cold, temperature fluctuations, all conditions that typically accelerate decomposition and destroy forensic evidence. Under normal circumstances, after 6 weeks of outdoor exposure, biological evidence would be severely degraded if not completely destroyed. But these weren't normal circumstances. The abandoned Volkswagen that Kondro had used to hide the body had created an unintended consequence. The metal car body, pressed down over Kara's remains, had acted as a makeshift refrigerator. It had blocked sunlight, retained cold, and created a microenvironment that significantly slowed decomposition. Kara's upper body, which had been more exposed to the elements, showed significant decomposition, but her lower body, protected by the Volkswagen's inadvertent refrigeration, was remarkably preserved. That preservation would prove absolutely critical to solving not just Kara's murder, but another case as well. The body was transported to Dr. Larry Lumen, an experienced forensic pathologist based in Portland, Oregon. Dr. Lumen held board certifications in both anatomic pathology and forensic pathology, with decades of experience handling complex death investigations. If anyone could extract evidence from remains that had been exposed for 6 weeks, it was him. Dr. Lumen's examination confirmed what everyone had feared. The cause of death was strangulation. Evidence of sexual assault was clear and undeniable. This was a sexually motivated homicide of a child. But the careful preservation of Kara's lower body meant that biological evidence remained intact. Dr. Lumen carefully collected swabs from oral, rectal, and vaginal areas and sent them to the forensic laboratory for DNA analysis. By 1996 and 1997, DNA technology had advanced significantly beyond the early techniques of the 1980s. Forensic scientists could now use PCR polymerase chain reaction to amplify tiny amounts of genetic material into quantities large enough for analysis. They could use STR short tandem repeat analysis to create highly specific DNA profiles that could definitively link suspects to evidence. From the preserved tissue samples, forensic scientists successfully isolated approximately 150 sperm cells. The DNA was extracted, amplified, and analyzed to create a complete profile. That profile was then compared to reference samples collected from Joseph Kondro during his arrest. The results were definitive, unambiguous, and scientifically certain. The DNA matched Joseph Kondro. There was no doubt, no room for argument. The biological evidence proved that Joseph Kondro had sexually assaulted Kara Rudd before or during her murder. With DNA evidence linking Kondro to the crime, with witness testimony placing him with Kara on the day she disappeared, with his suspicious behavior and attempts to destroy evidence, prosecutors had everything they needed for a murder conviction. But they intended to go further. The Cowlitz County Prosecutor's Office announced they would seek the death penalty for aggravated first-degree murder. The charges were severe: felony murder in the commission of kidnapping and sexual assault of a child. Under Washington state law at the time, these circumstances qualified for capital punishment. If convicted, Joseph Kondro could be sentenced to death by lethal injection. And that's when everything began to fall apart. When Joseph Kondro was formally charged with aggravated first-degree murder in Kara Rudd's death, he had no money for a private attorney. The court appointed R. Wayne Tornaby Jr. to represent him. On the surface, Tornaby seemed like a reasonable choice. He was a practicing attorney with some criminal defense experience. He was available. He accepted the appointment. But Tornaby had very limited experience with death penalty cases, and he was in the midst of a severe personal crisis. 1 week into representing Kondro in this capital murder case, 1 week Tornaby was arrested on his second DUI charge. He had a drinking problem that was spiraling out of control. He was going through a divorce that was consuming his attention and emotional energy, and he was supposed to be the last line of defense between his client and a potential death sentence. As the case progressed through 1997, Tornaby's deficiencies became increasingly apparent. He sometimes appeared at court hearings with the smell of alcohol on his breath. He failed to prepare a critical mitigation packet, the comprehensive document containing vital information about Kondro's mental health history, his traumatic upbringing, his psychological evaluations, all the material that could potentially save a defendant's life during the penalty phase of a capital trial. Perhaps most critically, Tornaby never hired a DNA expert to review and potentially challenge the forensic evidence that was the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. The court had approved $3,500 for absolutely necessary expert witnesses, but Tornaby never spent that money. In a case where DNA evidence would be central, where the defense absolutely needed someone who could examine the laboratory procedures and potentially identify weaknesses or alternative explanations, having no DNA expert was potentially catastrophic. The prosecution took the unusual step of arguing that Tornaby wasn't qualified to handle such a complex DNA case. It's rare for prosecutors to raise concerns about defense competency. It could create grounds for appeal if they win a conviction. But the DNA issues were so significant, they felt compelled to speak up. Tornaby eventually withdrew from the case before trial, citing his divorce as consuming all his attention. The withdrawal came just days after his conviction on the DUI charge. He would later be disbarred in June of 2002 for abandoning his law practice entirely. He subsequently purchased the Boondocks Tavern in Longview and left the practice of law behind. Kondro's second attorney of Vancouver, Washington lawyer I'll refer to as Dane as some sources don't provide his full name, was considered by Judge Jim Wormy to be a death penalty expert based on his experience with prior capital cases. This would be Dane's fourth capital murder case. But during the representation, disaster struck again. Dane's law license was suspended by the Washington State Bar Association in 1998. He stopped showing up to court hearings in May of 1998, leaving Kondro without representation at a critical juncture in the case. For 15 months after his initial arrest, Kondro had cycling through inadequate counsel, experienced severe gaps in representation, and was facing potential execution without consistent legal advocacy. Finally, 2 new attorneys were assigned to take over the defense. They had to start essentially from scratch, reviewing everything, trying to build a defense strategy for a case that was already damaged by the prior representation problems. Neither of these new attorneys was on the state's recommended list for capital defense work, a specialized roster of lawyers with specific training and experience in death penalty cases. Judge Worm's appointments had consistently bypassed this recommended list. The judge also failed to check the Washington State Bar Association's disciplinary records before making appointments which would have revealed Dane's impending license suspension. And initially, the case didn't follow the 2-attorney standard that was recommended for capital cases. The entire representation structure was a mess, and legal observers began questioning whether any conviction that resulted could survive appeal. The Washington State Supreme Court had been increasingly willing to overturn death sentences where defense representation was constitutionally inadequate, and this case was looking like a textbook example of ineffective assistance of counsel. While Kondro sat in Cowlitz County Jail facing trial for Kara's murder, investigators had never forgotten about Rima Traxler. The similarities between the cases were too striking to ignore. Both blonde girls from Longview, both connected to Kondro, both vanished without a trace initially. By 1996, Kondro had been formally identified as the second person of interest in Rima's 14-year-old cold case. The friendship between Kondro and Rusty Traxler, destroyed by the investigation, had placed Kondro at the scene on the day of Rima's disappearance. Witnesses had reported seeing a vehicle matching Kondro's truck near where Rima was last seen, but there was no physical evidence. Rima's body had never been found. And without a body, without forensic evidence, without a confession, charging Kondro with a murder from 1985 would be nearly impossible. The DNA evidence linking Kondro to Kara was overwhelming. But for Rima's case, there was nothing comparable. The passage of 14 years, the absence of remains, the lack of crime scene evidence. It all added up to a case that would be incredibly difficult to prosecute successfully. Unless Kondro talked, unless he confessed, unless he agreed to reveal what happened. In February of 1999, with the trial scheduled to begin in mid-April, Kondro's defense team approached prosecutors with an extraordinary proposal. Joseph Kondro would agree to plead guilty to reduced charges in Kara Rudd's case. He would confess to the previously uncharged murder of Rima Traxler. He would reveal the location of Rima's body. He would provide a detailed statement about both murders. And he would agree never to appeal his sentence. In exchange, the prosecution would take the death penalty off the table. It was a calculated offer. Kondro's attorneys recognized that the defense representation issues created a significant likelihood that any death sentence would be overturned on appeal. They knew the DNA evidence was nearly impossible to overcome. They understood their client would spend his life in prison regardless. But by offering the Rima confession, they had leverage. They could give prosecutors something they desperately wanted: closure for a 14-year-old case that had tormented a mother for more than a decade, that had remained officially unsolved, that had hung over the community like a dark cloud. Prosecutor Jim Stonier faced an agonizing decision. On one hand, he believed Joseph Kondro deserved the death penalty. The premeditated kidnapping, sexual assault, and murder of a 12-year-old child was exactly the kind of crime capital punishment was designed to address. On the other hand, death penalty cases often took decades to resolve. Appeals stretched on for years. Victims' families had to relive the trauma through multiple court proceedings. And given the representation issues in this case, there was a very real possibility that a death sentence would ultimately be overturned. Meanwhile, somewhere in Colorado, Donnell Kinn was living with 14 years of unanswered questions about what happened to her daughter. Stonier made an unusual decision. He flew to Cripple Creek, Colorado, to speak with Donnell face-to-face about the proposed plea agreement. He wanted her to understand the trade-offs, to have a voice in the decision, to know that prosecutors were considering her needs alongside the pursuit of maximum punishment for Kondro. When Stonier met with Donnell, he saw the toll that 14 years of uncertainty had taken. She'd never been able to properly mourn her daughter because she couldn't truly accept that Rima was dead. There was always that tiny sliver of hope, that possibility that maybe somehow Rima was alive somewhere. That hope prevented closure, but also prevented her from moving forward with her life. Donnell needed answers. She needed to know what happened. She needed, if possible, to recover her daughter's body and lay her to rest properly. After discussing the options with Donnell, considering the likelihood of years of appeals, and weighing the value of finally solving Rima's case, Prosecutor Stonier concluded, "We felt it was in the victim's interest and the community's interest." The plea deal was accepted. On a Saturday in February 1999, Detective Scott McDaniel, the same detective whose hunch had led to finding Kara's body, sat down with Joseph Kondro for what would become a 22-hour interview. It was a marathon session, conducted in careful stages with breaks for food and rest. But through it all, McDaniel maintained focus on one goal: getting Joseph Kondro to tell the truth about what he'd done. And Kondro talked. Without emotion, without remorse, with the detached precision of someone describing routine tasks, Joseph Kondro confessed to 2 murders. May 15, 1985. Kondro described the afternoon he took Rima Traxler's life with disturbing clarity. "I was driving to the store for beer and cigarettes," he began, his voice flat and emotionless. "I saw this little blonde girl walking home from school. I recognized her. It was Rima, Rusty's stepdaughter." He paused, then continued. "And I had this thought. I thought, if she gets into my car, I'm going to take her out to the woods." It wasn't an impulse, Kondro emphasized. It was a conscious decision made in that moment when he saw an opportunity. "I pulled up next to her on Beach Street. She saw me and came over to the truck. She goes, 'Hi, Joe.' And I said, 'Hi, I'm here to pick you up. The password is unicorn. Get in.'" Kondro's voice held a note of satisfaction as he described how easily the password worked. "She gets in my truck, bang, closes the door. Just like that. She trusted me completely." He told Rima he was taking her to a swimming hole, that her parents would meet them there later. She believed him without question. "I drove her to Germany Creek," Kondro continued. "It's about 12 miles west of Longview toward Stella along Ocean Beach Highway. There's a swimming hole there, real isolated, nobody around." What happened at Germany Creek, Kondro described in clinical terms that obscured the absolute horror of what he'd done to an 8-year-old child. He sexually assaulted her. He beat her. He strangled her until she stopped breathing. "Then I buried her in a shallow grave behind a tree," Kondro said, "covered her with debris. I figured if I could take her and bury her in a place far enough away, there was no way they'd go find her or go looking for her there." He paused, then added with chilling pride, "I was right." For 14 years, Rima Traxler had lain in that shallow grave while her mother desperately searched for answers, while her family disintegrated under the weight of not knowing, while the community grieved and feared. And Joseph Kondro had known exactly where she was the entire time. "That night," Kondro continued, "Donnell came to my house. She was panicking because Rima hadn't come home. She asked to use my phone to report her missing." Detective McDaniel asked how he felt in that moment, standing there while Rima's mother used his phone to report a crime he'd committed just hours earlier. "Nothing," Kondro replied simply. "I felt nothing. I helped her make the call. I pretended to be concerned. It was easy. The betrayal was almost incomprehensible. Danelle had turned to a trusted friend in her darkest hour, never knowing that friend was the monster who destroyed her life. November 21st, 1996. 11 years later, Kondro saw another opportunity. Kara was skipping school that day, Kondro explained. I saw her in the parking lot at Monticello Middle School. I pulled up in my Firebird and asked if she wanted a ride. She got in. Kondro's resentment about being evicted from the garage still simmered. He blamed Kara for complaining about him, for taking away his free meal ticket. In his narcissistic mind, this 12-year-old child deserved what was coming. I took her to Germany Creek first, Kondro said. Same place I'd taken Rima. Then we went to an abandoned house in the Willow Grove area near the Columbia River. At that abandoned house, Kondro sexually assaulted 12-year-old Kara Rudd. Then he strangled her to death. Things just got out of hand, Kondro claimed, as if the premeditated kidnapping and murder of a child was somehow accidental. With Kara's body in his vehicle, Kondro drove to Mount Solo. I went to this ravine about a mile off Industrial Way, maybe 50 yards from a dirt road. I dragged her down into the ravine. Then came the detail that would inadvertently preserve the evidence that convicted him. There was this old Volkswagen car body down there, all rusted out. I was so full of adrenaline, I was able to lift it up and put it over her body. The Volkswagen was meant to hide the evidence. Instead, it preserved it long enough for forensic science to identify her killer with absolute certainty. Throughout the interrogation, Kondro offered insights into his psychology that were both illuminating and deeply disturbing. I'm like an alligator resting at the bottom of a pond, he explained, using a metaphor he'd apparently been refining for years. Sometimes I come up to feed. There's an adrenaline rush. It's kind of addicting. Killing for me was just like second nature now. He described his emotional state with clinical precision. If you hook up a meter to my emotions, they're flatline. I don't know where my emotions are. I couldn't give a damn what anybody thinks. I'm a sociopath, psychopath. I've done a lot of weird things. Kondro acknowledged being a serial child rapist ever since I was a child myself. He noted that his victims never got older as he aged, a chilling admission that while he matured physically, his sexual interest remained fixated on children. When Detective McDaniel asked if Kondro would have continued if he hadn't been caught, the answer was immediate. Yeah, I would have just kept on going. And when asked what he would change if he could go back, Kondro's response revealed his complete lack of remorse. I would have hidden Kara's body better, so I'd be free now to rape and kill again. Not I wish I hadn't done it, not I wish I could take it back, just regret that he'd been caught. He never expressed remorse for his victims. He never acknowledged their humanity. He never showed the slightest recognition that he'd destroyed families and traumatized an entire community. Joseph Kondro was exactly what he claimed to be, a monster in human form. In February of 1999, Joseph Kondro appeared in Cowlitz County Superior Court before Judge Jim Wormy to formally enter his guilty pleas. The courtroom was packed with family members, investigators, prosecutors, defense attorneys, and media representatives. Kara's mother, Janet Holden, sat in the gallery, her face showing the strain of more than 2 years since her daughter's murder. Danelle Ken had flown in from Colorado, finally about to hear what happened to her daughter after 14 years of agonizing uncertainty. Kondro was brought in wearing jail-issued clothing and stocking feet they hadn't let him wear shoes. He sat at the defense table, almost motionless except for one foot that twitched occasionally and toes that wiggled with nervous energy. The proceedings began with Judge Wormy carefully explaining the plea agreement and ensuring Kondro understood what he was admitting. Then, reading from prepared statements provided by his attorneys, Kondro spoke in a soft, dispassionate voice that showed no emotion whatsoever. Count I, Kara Patricia Rudd, guilty to first-degree felony murder, reduced from aggravated first-degree murder. On or about November 21st, 1996, I did intentionally restrain, abduct, or kidnap Kara Rudd by transporting her in my car to an abandoned building located in Cowlitz County, Washington. Judge Wormy asked directly, "Did you also commit a sex offense against Kara Rudd?" "Yes," Kondro replied simply. Count A, Rima Traxler, guilty to second-degree intentional murder. On or about May 15, 1985. I did with intent to cause the death of Rima Traxler, to cause her death by means of strangulation, and then concealed her body on a creek bank in Cowlitz County, Washington. As Kondro made these admissions, speaking about the murder of 2 children in the same flat, emotionless tone someone might use to describe grocery shopping, Janet Holden heaved a sob that echoed through the silent courtroom. Danelle Kin grimaced with anguish, her face contorting as 14 years of not knowing finally crystallized into terrible certainty. The formal sentencing hearing was held the following Friday afternoon in March of 1999. Before Judge Warmy imposed sentence, he allowed the victims' families to make statements. Danelle Kinney stepped forward, her prepared statement trembling slightly in her hands as she began to read. I have been waiting 14 years for answers. 14 years of not knowing if my daughter was dead or alive. 14 years of wondering if she might walk through my door someday. 14 years of searching every crowd for her face. Her voice strengthened as she continued. Yet to finally have answers does not ease the pain. It doesn't bring Rima back. It doesn't give me back the 14 years I lost to this uncertainty. The fact that this man deceived me for so long, all the while knowing the truth, leaves me with an inability to comprehend the monster that lies beneath the shell of a human who sits here today. The betrayal that Joseph Kondro had been there from the very beginning, had helped her file the missing person report, had watched her suffer for 14 years, while knowing exactly what he'd done was almost harder to bear than the murder itself. He looked me in the eyes, Danelle said, her voice breaking. He comforted me. He let me use his phone. And the whole time, he knew my baby was dead in a shallow grave, because he put her there. Janet Holden's statement carried a different kind of pain, the agony of having invited the monster into her home, having trusted him with access to her children, having her act of charity repaid with the murder of her daughter. He was my friend, since we were kids, Janet said. I thought I knew him. I thought he was harmless. When he needed a place to stay, I gave him our garage. My daughters called him Uncle Joe. She paused, struggling to maintain composure. I let him into my home. I fed him meals at my table. I trusted him around my children. And he repaid that trust by taking my baby girl's life. Dennis Riom, Kara's grandfather, couldn't restrain his anger. His statement was brief, but filled with rage. He deserves to burn in hell. I hope he suffers every single day for what he did. I hope the knowledge of what he is eats at him, though I know it won't because he's not human. He's a monster. Judge Jim Warm listened to the family statements, reviewed the plea agreement, and considered the sentencing guidelines. Then he imposed sentence. 55 years in prison with no possibility of parole, to be served at Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla. The standard sentencing range for the murder convictions topped out at almost 56 years, so the sentence was near the maximum allowed. Given that Kondro was 39 years old at the time of sentencing, he would be eligible for release at age 101. In other words, he would die in prison. The sentence would begin running in 2010, after Kondro completed his 14-year term from the 1997 conviction for child rape and molestation from 1991. Effectively, he was being given a life sentence with the certainty he would never walk free. Prosecutor Jim Stonier addressed the media afterward. We're giving up the death penalty, and in exchange, he's going to be in prison until he's past 100 years old. He'll die there. And we've solved a 14-year-old cold case that was destroying a mother. Chief Deputy Prosecutor Sue Barr, who had faced Kondro across the courtroom throughout the proceedings, shared her experience of prosecuting him. I have only twice in 25 years felt the presence of true evil in a courtroom. When he and I would look at each other, it was a feeling that there was nothing there in those eyes. No humanity. No soul. Just emptiness. I never got any shred of humanity from him. Police Chief Bob Bergreen expressed relief for the community. This really brings closure to 2 of the most horrible crimes ever to be committed in this county. Families can have some peace knowing this man will never walk free. As part of the plea agreement, Kondro had agreed never to appeal his sentence. This provision ensured finality for the victims' families and avoided the years or even decades of death penalty appeals that could have reopened wounds repeatedly. Despite Joseph Kondro's detailed confession and his agreement to provide the location where he'd buried Rima Traxler 14 years earlier, Recovery of her remains proved impossible. In December of 1997, before the plea deal was finalized, investigators had conducted searches of the Mount Solo area, hoping to find Rima's body based on early suspicions. They found nothing. After Kondro's confession in February of 1999, extensive searches were conducted at Germany Creek, the location he'd identified as Rima's burial site. Germany Creek is a challenging search environment. As a tidally influenced tributary to the Columbia River, water levels change throughout the day. Dense vegetation covers much of the area. The terrain is unstable in places, with soft ground and hidden hazards. Weather conditions in late winter made thorough searches difficult. More significantly, 14 years had passed since Kondro buried Rima there. Trees had grown, vegetation had changed, erosion had altered the landscape. The markers Kondro remembered a particular tree, a distinctive rock formation. A bend in the creek might not exist anymore or might look completely different. Search teams used cadaver dogs, ground-penetrating radar, and systematic grid searches. They brought in experts in locating clandestine graves. They searched for weeks. But Rima's body was never found. Because Rima Traxler's remains were never recovered, her case remains technically unsolved in official missing persons databases. The Charlie Project, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, NCMEC. Case number 601923. And other missing persons registries still list her as missing. Her case is classified as a non-family abduction. The investigating agency remains the Longview Police Department, and tips are still accepted, though none have led to recovery of remains. This technical distinction matters for databases and statistics. But in practical terms, everyone involved knows what happened. Joseph Kondro confessed. He was convicted. He provided details only the killer would know. Rima is dead. Joseph Kondro killed her. Her body is somewhere near Germany Creek, 12 miles west of Longview. But without physical remains, there's no absolute proof. No DNA confirmation. No forensic verification. Just a confession from a psychopath who might have lied about the location to avoid the death penalty. For Donnell Kin, the absence of Rima's body creates ongoing torment. Some sources indicate that Donnell doesn't fully believe Kondro was responsible, thinking he may have lied about killing Rima to avoid the death penalty. It seems irrational. Why would Kondro confess to a murder he didn't commit? But grief isn't rational. And the lack of physical evidence, the absence of her daughter's remains, leaves room for doubt, for hope, for the terrible possibility that Rima might somehow still be alive. Over the years, there have been unconfirmed sightings reported as far away as New York. Every few years, someone calls in a tip about a woman who might be Rima, now grown up. None have proven credible. But for a mother who's lost her child, even the most unlikely possibility offers a thread of hope to cling to. Donnell has never been able to properly mourn Rima or lay her to rest. There's no grave to visit, no place where she can go to feel close to her daughter. Just an empty space where her 8-year-old should be. Joseph Robert Kondro was transferred to Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla to begin serving his sentence. Often housed in isolation or protective custody due to the nature of his crimes, prisoners who harm children are targeted by other inmates. Kondro settled into what would be his permanent home. He adapted to prison life with the same emotionless detachment he displayed throughout the investigation and trial. He followed rules when it suited him. He manipulated when possible. He existed without apparent distress or discomfort. And he continued to show absolutely no remorse. In 1999, shortly after his conviction, Kondro gave extensive interviews to reporters. His statements during these interviews provided additional insight into his complete lack of humanity. People that go out and take somebody's life without remorse, give them the death penalty. Kill them, Kondro said, speaking about himself in hypothetical third-person terms. If someone did what I did, I'd want them on death row. It's outrageous that someone as cold-blooded as him could cut a deal. The dissociation was striking, referring to himself as him and someone, as if discussing a completely different person rather than his own actions. He expressed amazement that he'd avoided execution. "I can't believe they let me live. I thought for sure I'd get the death penalty." When asked why he confessed to Rima's murder when there was no physical evidence connecting him to that case, Kondro was pragmatic. I was going to die in prison anyway. The DNA on Kara's case was too strong. So I figured, why not trade the information for my life? Made sense to me. It was transactional, practical, completely devoid of any recognition that he was talking about the murders of 2 children. Joseph Kondro attracted significant attention from criminal profilers and forensic psychologists. His case exemplified many characteristics of serial child predators and provided valuable insights for law enforcement training. John E. Douglas, legendary founder of the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit and one of the pioneers of criminal offender profiling, studied Kondro extensively. Douglas had famously interviewed numerous serial killers, including Ed Kemper, Richard Speck, Charles Manson, and others, to develop psychological profiles that could help solve crimes. Kondro became a subject in Douglas's work, featured in the MSNBC documentary Mindhunter, the same documentary that would later inspire the popular Netflix series of the same name, and discussed at length in Douglas's 2019 book, The Killer Across the Table. Co-authored with Mark Olshaker, Douglas identified several key characteristics in Kondro's profile: early onset psychopathy, the violence, animal torture, substance abuse, and sexual offending beginning in early childhood indicated deep-seated psychological abnormalities present from birth or very early development. Lack of emotional capacity. Kondro's repeated descriptions of having flatline emotions, of feeling nothing, demonstrated the affective deficit characteristic of psychopathy. Strategic positioning. Kondro's deliberate cultivation of relationships with families who had young daughters showed sophisticated planning and patience, unusual in impulsive offenders. The grooming process. By integrating himself into families, becoming Uncle Joe, Kondro ensured his victims would trust him completely and come willingly. Victim selection. Both known murder victims were blonde girls between ages 8 and 12, suggesting a specific type preference. Use of locations. Kondro returned to Germany Creek for both murders, indicating a comfort zone and possibly ritual significance. Compartmentalization. The ability to help Donnell file a missing person report hours after murdering her daughter demonstrated extreme compartmentalization and dissociation. Between 2009 and 2011, Kondro exchanged at least 65 pages of letters with California author Lori Carangelo, who was researching his case for a book. The correspondence began when Kondro reached out to Carangelo for help with adoption research. He wanted to find information about his biological family and the circumstances of his adoption. Carangelo, who had experience with adoption searches, initially agreed to help. As their correspondence developed, Kondro expressed interest in having his story told through a book or possibly a movie. He sent childhood photographs with signed privacy releases. He wrote long letters describing his thoughts, his crimes, his psychology. Carangelo later described Kondro's writing style and interaction as maintaining an unfailingly courteous and respectful tone that seemed disconnected from the horrific nature of his crimes. It was the mask again, the charm, the smooth presentation, the ability to seem like a reasonable person even while discussing monstrous acts. Throughout the correspondence, Kondro repeatedly requested copies of law enforcement records, crime scene photographs, and autopsy photos. Carangelo refused all such requests, recognizing them as inappropriate and potentially disturbing extensions of Kondro's continued fascination with his crimes. Kondro also expressed paranoia about other inmates, claiming many wanted to kill him due to the nature of his offenses. This was likely accurate. Prisoners who harm children are universally despised even among other criminals. Most significantly, Kondro hinted at additional victims but refused to provide details. He feared that confessing to more murders might somehow result in the death penalty being reinstated or other legal consequences. Police had questioned him about more than 70 other killings and disappearances of young girls in southwestern Washington and throughout the Pacific Northwest region. The sheer number of cases they asked about indicated the scope of unsolved crimes that potentially matched his methodology. The 11-year gap between Rima's murder in 1985 and Kara's in 1996 seemed significant. Kondro had stated he would have just kept on going if he hadn't been caught. He described killing as second nature and addicting. Did he really go 11 years without acting on these compulsions? Or were there other victims during that period whose bodies were never found or whose deaths were never connected to him? Kondro remained a prime suspect in the 1982 murder of 8-year-old Sheila M. Silvernails of Kalama, Washington. Sheila, born October 13, 1973, disappeared on April 20, 1982, on her way to catch the school bus. She was just 8 years old, the same age as Rima would be 3 years later. Her nude body was found the next day at the bottom of a ravine approximately 3 miles from her home. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled, a methodology strikingly similar to Kondro's known crimes. Kondro had connections to the Kalama area. Some sources suggest he may have had connections to Sheila's family or the neighborhood where she lived, though these details haven't been definitively confirmed. Despite the strong circumstantial similarities, Kondro was never charged with Sheila's murder. The case remained unsolved for decades. In 2022, the Cowlitz County Sheriff's Office announced they were re-examining Sheila's case using advanced DNA technology. In their announcement, they noted that many people had incorrectly linked Kondro to the crime over the years, but he had died in 2012 without ever being charged. The statement seemed to suggest DNA had excluded Kondro as Sheila's killer, though the sheriff's office didn't explicitly confirm this. The case remains under investigation. Kondro's statement that he had been a serial child rapist ever since I was a child himself, combined with his admission that his victims never got older as he aged, suggested a pattern of predation spanning decades. If we take him at his word, and psychopaths often take pride in their crimes, sometimes exaggerating but rarely understating their offenses, Kondro began sexually assaulting children when he was a child himself, possibly as young as 7 or 8 years old, when he was first molesting young girls. From approximately 1966 or 67 through his final arrest in 1996, that's nearly 30 years of potential offending. The 1991 Clark County convictions for assaulting 3 girls proved he was active during the supposed gap between Rima and Kara. How many victims were there really? How many families never got answers? How many missing person cases from the Pacific Northwest during those decades might be connected to Joseph Kondro? He took those answers to his grave. On May 3, 2012, 16 days before what would have been his 53rd birthday, Joseph Robert Kondro died at Washington State Penitentiary. The cause of death was liver disease, likely related to hepatitis C infection, a common condition among long-term drug users and those with extensive criminal histories involving shared needles or high-risk behaviors. He was 52 years old. He had served 13 years of his 55-year sentence. He would never have been eligible for parole. He would never have walked free. He would have died in prison eventually, regardless. But his death at 52 meant he avoided the full consequences of his sentence. He avoided decades more of imprisonment. He avoided growing old behind bars, alone and despised. When news of Kondro's death reached the victims' families, their responses reflected the complex mixture of relief and unhealed trauma that had defined their lives since losing their daughters. Dennis Riome, Kara's grandfather, was blunt and unforgiving. He's burning in hell right now. I hope he suffered. I hope his death was painful. I hope he felt even a fraction of the terror and pain he inflicted on those little girls. Janet Holden, Kara's mother, who was 50 years old when Kondro died, expressed a different emotion relief. It's a big weight lifted off. I know Rima's mom and us, we lived in horror and terror for a long time. There was always this fear that somehow he might get out, might win an appeal, might escape. Now it's finally over. Now we just live our lives as best we can. Not much else we can do. Sue Bohr, the former chief deputy prosecutor who had faced Kondro in court and felt the presence of true evil in his eyes, admitted she needed proof. I still want to see that death certificate. I know it sounds paranoid, but I need to see that official document, just to lock up that little bit of fear in my heart that he could do this again. I need to know he's really gone. For the families, Kondro's death brought a measure of peace. The monster was gone. He would never hurt another child. They could stop looking over their shoulders. But it didn't bring back Rima or Kara. It didn't undo the decades of trauma. It didn't heal the wounds. In 2013, author Lori Carangelo published an ebook titled Kondro, the untold story of the Longview serial killer based on her correspondence with Kondro between 2009 and 2011. The book provided additional insights into Kondro's psychology, his thought processes, his view of his crimes, and his complete lack of remorse. It included portions of his letters, analysis of his behavior, and exploration of the questions that remained unanswered. Corangelo's work served as a documentary record of a predator's own words, valuable for researchers, law enforcement professionals, and anyone trying to understand the psychology of serial child killers. The Unicorn Password case became a significant cautionary tale in child safety education, studied by parents, educators, and law enforcement across the country. Rima's parents had done everything right according to the conventional wisdom of the 1980s. They'd taught their daughter a secret password. They'd trained her never to go with anyone who couldn't provide it. They'd drilled the safety measure into her mind from early childhood. But the system had a fatal flaw. It assumed the threat would come from strangers. The password was ineffective because the perpetrator was a trusted family friend who had legitimate access to family information. Rima Traxler shared the password with Joseph Kondro for completely understandable reasons. If there was ever an emergency, if someone needed to pick up Rima, the trusted friend should know the safety word. It made perfect sense. It was a rational decision, and it was exploited with devastating consequences. Modern child safety education has evolved significantly based on cases like this one. Experts now emphasize most abuse comes from known, trusted adults. Stranger danger is real, but statistically rare. The majority of child abuse, molestation, and abduction is committed by someone the child knows: family members, family friends, coaches, teachers, religious leaders, neighbors. Boundary education is crucial. Children need to understand that they have the right to say no to any adult if something feels wrong, even adults they know and love. Teaching bodily autonomy and consent starts early. Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Children should be taught to trust that internal warning system and to tell parents if any adult makes them uncomfortable, even if nothing overtly inappropriate has happened yet. Secrets versus surprises. Healthy surprises, like birthday presents, are revealed eventually. Secrets that adults ask children to keep, especially about physical contact or activities, are red flags. Multiple safety layers. No single safety measure is sufficient. Supervision, education, open communication, background checks, and multiple overlapping protections create better security than any one system. The Unicorn Password failed because it was a single-layer defense against a threat from the wrong direction. It protected against strangers but left Rima vulnerable to the greater danger: predators who position themselves as trusted adults. Both Rima Traxler and Kara Rudd knew Joseph Kondro as Uncle Joe, or a trusted family friend. He wasn't a stranger lurking in shadows. He was invited into homes, shared meals at family tables, was present at gatherings and celebrations, and earned complete trust over years of relationship building. This pattern, a trusted adult positioning himself to access vulnerable children, is the typical profile of child predators. Studies consistently show that the majority of child sexual abuse is committed by someone the child knows and trusts. Kondro's own words revealed his deliberate strategy. Try to do this with a stranger or something like that. You know, they always fight back. I wanted everything to run perfectly, and it did. He understood that children who knew him, who trusted him, who saw him as a safe adult in their lives, wouldn't fight back. They wouldn't scream. They wouldn't run. They would do exactly what he told them to do, because that's what good children do when trusted adults give them instructions. His methodology was sophisticated. Long-term relationship building. Kondro cultivated friendships with families over years, not weeks or months. He became woven into the fabric of their lives. Providing help and support, he offered assistance with household projects, gave rides, babysat, and made himself useful. This created both gratitude and dependence. Targeting vulnerable families, single mothers, families in crisis, people struggling financially. These were his preferred targets because they needed help and were less likely to scrutinize his motives. Integrating into daily routines. By living in the garage at the Rudd home, by being present at the Traxler home frequently, Kondro became part of the normal environment, rather than a visitor. Patient waiting, Kondro didn't rush. He waited for the perfect opportunity when a child would be accessible and when he could act without immediate detection. When Rima disappeared, her mother's first instinct was to call Kondro for help. When Kara needed a ride, getting into Uncle Joe's car seemed perfectly safe and natural. The trust these families placed in Joseph Kondro wasn't foolish or negligent, it was human. We want to believe in the goodness of people we've known for years. We want to trust our friends. We want our children to have caring adults in their lives beyond just parents. Kondro exploited that fundamental human need for community and connection. While the Kondro case represents a failure to protect Rima and Kara, it also demonstrates the critical importance of investigative persistence. Detective Scott McDaniel's decision to search Mount Solo after 44 days of fruitless searching exemplified the kind of dedicated police work that solves cases. He didn't give up. He didn't accept defeat. He played a hunch based on accumulated knowledge about Kondro's habits and haunts. That hunch led to finding Kara's body. Finding the body led to the forensic evidence. The forensic evidence led to the conviction. And the conviction through the plea bargain led to solving Rima's 14-year-old cold case. None of that happens if McDaniel gives up after 6 weeks of searching. The case also demonstrates the value of maintaining cold case investigations. Even after 14 years, even with no physical evidence, the Longview Police Department and Cowlitz County Sheriff's Office never closed Rima's file. They continued to investigate leads. They continued to question suspects. They kept the case alive. When Kondro was arrested for Kara's murder, investigators immediately connected it to Rima's disappearance because they'd never stopped working that case. The institutional memory, the preserved evidence, the continued attention, all of it mattered. The Kondro case perfectly illustrates how advancing forensic technology changes criminal investigations. In 1985, when Rima disappeared, DNA analysis was in its infancy. The first criminal case using DNA evidence in the United States wasn't decided until 1987. Even if Rima's body had been found immediately in 1985, the DNA technology to conclusively link Kondro to the crime didn't exist yet. By 1996 and 97, when Kara's body was discovered, DNA technology had advanced dramatically. PCR amplification, polymerase chain reaction, allowed forensic scientists to amplify tiny amounts of genetic material into quantities large enough for analysis. This meant even degraded samples could potentially yield results. STR analysis, short tandem repeat analysis, created highly specific DNA profiles that could definitively link suspects to evidence with statistical certainty measuring in billions or trillions to one. Improved collection and preservation. Forensic protocols for collecting, preserving, and analyzing biological evidence had become standardized and sophisticated. The fortuitous preservation of Kara's body by the Volkswagen Refrigerator, combined with these technological advances, created the perfect storm for solving the case. The 150 sperm cells that forensic scientists isolated and analyzed wouldn't have been sufficient for conviction in 1985, but by 1997, they provided absolutely conclusive evidence. That DNA evidence was so overwhelming that Kondro, who had maintained his innocence for 2 years and who had no physical evidence linking him to the 1985 murder, confessed to both crimes to avoid the death penalty. Forensic science didn't just solve Kara's case, it solved Rima's as well. 14 years later, the Kondro case became a prominent example in investigative journalism about systemic problems with capital punishment in Washington state. The Seattle Post-Intelligencer's extensive Uncertain Justice series, which examined death penalty cases throughout Washington, used Kondro as a case study in how inadequate defense representation undermines the justice system, even when defendants are clearly guilty. The problems were severe and multi-layered. Unqualified initial appointment. Tornaby had minimal death penalty experience and was in personal crisis when appointed. Active substance abuse. An attorney showing up to court hearings with alcohol on his breath cannot provide effective representation. Failure to spend approved funds. $3,500 for expert witnesses went unspent despite being absolutely necessary. No DNA expert. In a case where DNA was the central evidence, having no defense expert to examine the procedures and potentially identify weaknesses was potentially catastrophic. Second attorney's license suspension. Dane's law license was suspended mid-case, leaving Kondro without representation at a critical juncture. Judge's appointment failures. Judge Warmay ignored the state's recommended attorney list, failed to verify bar disciplinary records, and didn't follow the two-attorney standard initially. The result was a case where the defense representation was so inadequate that a death sentence, if imposed, would likely have been overturned on appeal. Ironically, these failures may have saved Kondro's life. The prosecution's decision to accept the plea bargain was partially motivated by concern that the representation issues would doom any death sentence on appeal. The Washington State Supreme Court had been increasingly willing to overturn death sentences where defense representation was constitutionally inadequate. The Kondro case looked like a textbook example of ineffective assistance of counsel. So by failing to provide adequate representation, the system accidentally incentivized the plea bargain that took death penalty off the table while solving 2 murders and providing closure to families. The case contributed to broader debates about Washington's death penalty system, which would ultimately be abolished by the state Supreme Court in October 2018 as unconstitutional based on arbitrary and racially biased application. Kondro's case exemplified an ethically complex practice that occurred in at least 4 Washington cases over a 20-year period. Serial killers using bodies or confessions as bargaining chips to avoid maximum punishment. The practice raises profound ethical questions. Is it justice? Critics argued it was outrageous that someone as cold-blooded as Kondro could cut a deal and avoid execution. They saw it as the system failing to deliver appropriate punishment for heinous crimes. Does closure justify leniency? Supporters noted that the deal provided critical closure to Donnell Kin after 14 years of uncertainty and ensured Kondro would die in prison. They saw it as pragmatic balancing of competing interests. Does it incentivize killers to hide bodies? If holding back information about victims can be traded for leniency, does that encourage killers to hide evidence more effectively? What about other victims' families? If Kondro had information about 70+ other cases but refused to talk about them, didn't those families deserve the same closure opportunity given to Donnell Kin? Prosecutor Jim Stonier's decision to fly to Colorado to speak with Donnell face-to-face about the proposed deal showed unusual sensitivity to victim impact. He wanted her to have a voice in the decision, to understand the trade-offs, to know prosecutors were considering her needs. Donnell supported the deal. Getting answers after 14 years mattered more to her than seeing Kondro executed. But not everyone agreed. Some legal scholars and victims' rights advocates argued that prosecutorial duty is to pursue maximum punishment regardless of family preferences, that justice isn't a negotiable commodity, and that trading information for leniency sets dangerous precedents. There's no easy answer. The Kondro case illustrates the agonizing complexity of balancing retribution, closure, finality, and practical realities of the criminal justice system. The concentrated geography of the Kondro case is striking. All the key locations, the Highlands neighborhood, where both families lived, Street, Helen's Elementary School, Monticello Middle School, Mount Solo, and even Germany Creek, exist within a relatively small radius in and around Longview, Washington. This concentration reflects how predators often operate within familiar territory. Kondro knew these areas intimately. He knew the isolated spots along Germany Creek. He knew the wooded ravines of Mount Solo. He knew the streets of the Highlands, which families lived where, which children walked home alone. Local knowledge is one of a predator's greatest advantages. Kondro didn't have to scout unfamiliar territory or take risks in areas where he might be noticed as out of place. He was a local. He belonged there. Nobody questioned his presence. The same geographic concentration that made him effective also ultimately helped solve the case. The Longview Police Department and Cowlitz County Sheriff's Office knew the same terrain. They knew the same hiding places. When Detective McDaniel decided to search Mount Solo, he was drawing on the same local knowledge Kondro used, just applied to solving crimes instead of committing them. The Joseph Kondro cases fundamentally altered Longview, Washington, in ways that persist even decades later. The community's sense of safety, that small-town assumption that neighbors look out for each other, that children can walk home from school freely, that familiar faces can be trusted, was destroyed. Parents who'd allowed their children independence suddenly kept them on much shorter leashes. The fact that Kondro had been hiding in plain sight for decades, that he'd been invited into homes and trusted with children, created a paranoia that took years to fade. How do you know who to trust? How do you identify a predator when they look and act like everyone else? For the generation of children who grew up in Longview during and after the Kondro cases, the murders of Rima Traxler and Kara Rudd became cautionary tales that shaped their understanding of safety and trust. They learned earlier than they should have that monsters are real, and sometimes wear familiar faces. For Donnell Kinney and Janet Holden, the losses are eternal and irreparable. Donnell waited 14 years for answers and received only partial closure, knowing what happened but never recovering her daughter's body. She can't visit a grave. She can't lay flowers at a headstone. She can't have that physical place where Rima rests. Some part of her, perhaps irrationally but understandably, still hopes Rima might somehow be alive. Those unconfirmed sightings in New York and elsewhere feed that desperate hope. Logic says, Rima is dead. Kondro confessed. But a mother's heart doesn't always follow logic. Janet trusted a childhood friend with access to her family and paid the ultimate price. The guilt, even though it's not her fault, even though she couldn't have known gnaws at her. She gave Kondro the opportunity. She let him into their lives, her act of charity enabling her daughter's murder. Both mothers have had to reconstruct their lives around voids that can never be filled. They've survived, but survival isn't the same as healing. The wounds remain open, just scabbed over enough to function day to day. Kara's grandparents, Dennis and Pat Riome, carried their own burden of grief and rage. Dennis's venom toward Kondro, hoping he burns in hell, hoping he suffered, reflects the helpless fury of loving someone and being unable to protect them. These families will carry their losses to their own graves. There's no closure that brings back a murdered child. There's only learning to live with the absence, learning to breathe around the weight of grief, learning to find reasons to keep going. The Kondro cases contributed to significant evolution in how child safety is taught and understood. The unicorn password failure demonstrated that focusing exclusively on stranger danger leaves children vulnerable to greater threats from known, trusted adults. Modern child safety programs emphasize body autonomy education, teaching children from early ages that they control their own bodies and have the right to refuse unwanted touch, even from family and friends. Secret versus surprise distinctions, helping children understand that adults asking them to keep secrets about physical contact or activities is a red flag. Trusted adult networks, encouraging children to have multiple trusted adults they can talk to. So if one adult is the problem, they have others to turn to. Listening to instincts, validating children's feelings when something feels wrong, even if they can't articulate why. Open communication, creating family environments where children feel comfortable discussing uncomfortable topics without fear of punishment or disbelief. Recognizing grooming behaviors, teaching parents and caregivers to identify the gradual boundary pushing that predators use to desensitize children and families. The case is taught in law enforcement academies, social work programs, and child advocacy organizations as an example of how predators operate and how traditional safety measures can fail. The Kondro case remains significant in forensic science and legal education for several reasons. DNA preservation under adverse conditions. The Volkswagen Refrigerator effect demonstrated how unusual environmental factors can preserve evidence and why thorough crime scene processing matters. PCR and STR analysis capabilities. The successful extraction and analysis of DNA from 150 sperm cells showed the power of 1990s technology to solve cases impossible to prosecute earlier. Inadequate defense representation. The case became a textbook example in legal education of how systemic failures in capital defense undermine justice even when defendants are clearly guilty. Plea bargaining ethics. The body for life trade continues to be debated in legal ethics courses as an example of the complex calculations prosecutors must make. The case appears in forensic science textbooks, criminal justice curricula, and legal ethics courses as a multifaceted example of how investigations work, how technology solves crimes, and how legal systems can both succeed and fail simultaneously. The Joseph Kondro cases teach us painful but essential lessons about trust, safety, predation, and justice. Trust is necessary but must be wisely given. We can't function in society without trusting others. Community requires connection, but that trust should be earned, monitored, and revocable when warning signs appear. Predators exploit normal human connections. The greatest danger to children isn't strangers in vans offering candy. It's the uncle, the family friend, the neighbor, the coach who positions themselves for access. No single safety measure is sufficient. Passwords, rules, supervision, they all matter, but only in combination. Multiple overlapping protections create security better than any single system. Listen to warning signs. Kondro showed disturbing behavior from early childhood. Those signs were visible, but not acted upon. Early intervention matters. Technology changes investigations. The DNA evidence that convicted Kondro couldn't have existed in 1985. Cases once impossible to solve become solvable as science advances. Justice is complex and imperfect. The plea bargain that saved Kondro from execution also solved a 14-year-old cold case and provided closure to a devastated mother. Was it the right choice? There's no simple answer. Persistence solves cases. Detective McDaniel didn't give up after 6 weeks of searching. His hunch broke the case. Investigators who keep working cold cases sometimes get the break they need, years or decades later. Families never fully heal. Donnell Kinn and Janet Holden will carry their losses forever. Time doesn't heal all wounds, it just makes them bearable enough to survive. Joseph Kondro described himself as an alligator lying in wait, surfacing occasionally to feed. The metaphor was chillingly apt for a predator who positioned himself within trusting communities, patiently cultivating relationships until opportunity presented itself. His death in May 2012 ended his threat. He'll never hurt another child. He'll never betray another family's trust. He'll never use someone's kindness as camouflage for monstrous intent. But the wounds he inflicted on 2 families and an entire community will never fully heal. Rima Traxler and Kara Rudd should have grown up. They should have graduated high school, gone to college, pursued careers, fallen in love, perhaps had children of their own. Instead, their lives ended in terror and pain at the hands of someone their families trusted. Their names live on, not in celebration of lives well lived, but in caution against evil, hiding behind familiar faces. In remembering Rima and Kara, we honor them best by learning from their tragedies, by teaching our children about boundaries and body autonomy, by listening when something feels wrong, by creating communities where predators can't hide in plain sight, by never giving up on cold cases, by supporting families devastated by violence, and by remembering that, sometimes, the monster isn't a stranger in the shadows. Sometimes it's Uncle Joe. Thank you for watching this documentary investigation into the Joseph Kondro cases. These stories are difficult to hear, painful to research, and tragic in their impact, but they're important. By understanding how predators operate, by learning from the failures and successes of investigations, by honoring victims through remembrance and education, we create communities where children are safer. If you or someone you know has information about any unsolved missing person case, please contact the appropriate law enforcement agency. Even decades-old tips can break cases wide open. If you're a parent or caregiver concerned about child safety, please research evidence-based programs for teaching children about boundaries, body autonomy, and appropriate versus inappropriate behavior from adults. If this content has triggered difficult emotions or memories, please reach out to appropriate mental health resources in your area. Most importantly, stay vigilant, trust your instincts, and remember that keeping children safe requires community effort. The password was meant to protect Rima. It failed because the threat came from within the circle of trust. We can't eliminate all danger, but we can be smarter about recognizing it and braver about acting when something feels wrong. Thank you for your time and attention. Please like, subscribe, and share if you found this documentary valuable. See you in the next case.